we are going to take this pile of strips that I inherited from my mother-in-law, and we are going to turn them into a braided table runner like this. And you can't see the whole thing in frame right now, so I'll pop a picture on top during the editing process. But can you see here? This design is so much fun to make because it looks complex, but it really isn't. It's really easy. I'm going to share with you all my favorite tips and tricks and show you how you can make your own braided table runner for this fall season. One of the really fun things about working with a pattern like this, a really scrappy pattern like this, is that you've got options. For this little sample, you can see how I've grouped my orange and rusts together and grouped the greens together. And it gives it a little bit more of a color wash or ombre effect. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of how to make these braids shortly. But first, I just wanted to talk about this because it'll affect how you lay things out. Okay, for this one, you can see I've gone for a lot more of a scrappy, random looking color placement. It's actually not completely random because I'm alternating my dark, medium, light to create that really fun sparkle effect. And so let's see how to do this. Now we're back with the pile of strips, and what we need to do is sort them. Some of these are full length. They're the whole 42 to 44 inches, and some are shorter because these are her scraps from various projects. So I am just going to start sorting these, and I'm going to sort them into light, medium, and dark piles. And they don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to come out perfectly, but we want to have three distinct value families. And this is not absolutely necessary. If you wanted to skip this part, you could, and just make it completely scrappy, willy-nilly wherever it lands. But to get the most sparkle out of your design, I like to divide them up into value families. Okay, so I have all the fabrics sorted into three piles by value, relatively lighter, relatively darker, and more or less medium. Don't overthink this part because some of these could go in either one. Depending on what it was next to, you could call this a dark. This one might be a medium, depending. It doesn't matter, okay? Doesn't have to be perfect. There's not going to be a quiz. We just want them relatively lighter, relatively in the middle, and relatively darker. And this is going to be the secret to creating sparkle. Now, I'm using 2.5-inch strips because that's what I have. You can cut them from yardage or from fat quarters if that's what you have. I'm using a mix of strips from some jelly rolls that my mother-in-law had, and also some scraps from some of her previous projects. So I actually have more strips than what you would need if you were using all from a jelly roll, because I know that some of these strips are only partials. Now I'll put up a graphic with the exact number of strips that you need for each size. I'm going to show you two sizes. For one of the table runners, the small one, I recommend 14 strips. And for the larger, 16 strips. Now I have, I think, 20 here. But again, that's because these are not all whole. Now, this is a really fun thing to play with. You can see this is what it looks like when you're using 2.5-inch wide strips. But there's nothing magical about that. You could use wider or narrower strips, whatever your heart desires. Now in this table runner, which is my smaller one, I used strips that were 2.5 inches wide by 5.5 inches long. For this one, I'm going to use 2.5 inches wide by 6 inches long. Now, if you're in the Quilting Friends membership, there will be a printable that you can download for free. If you're not in the membership, don't worry. I'll put the information on the screen for you. Okay, so let's take these. My next step is I need to iron these babies so that they're all nice and flat and smooth before we cut them. Okay, here are my light fabrics, and I've stacked them up, making sure to line them up on this end. The other end of the strips do not line up perfectly because they're different lengths, but as long as they're lined up exactly on this end, that'll be fine. So then I'm going to come in and do my first cut just to get that really tightly woven bit off. Okay. And now I'm going to cut them in 6-inch segments. So just like that. And like that. And I'm cutting through multiple layers at once, which I prefer, but you can do one at a time if you're more comfortable with that. Again, we'll drag this up so we can finish cutting them. And I'm just going to line this up on the line because this is actually a very forgiving technique. It's okay if it's a thread off a little bit when you cut. It's really not going to hurt anything because we are going to trim later. So just a couple more. And I should be able to get 7 pieces out of these long batik strips, the ones that are whole. The ones that are partials, I'll just get as many as I can. Now, if you were using non-batik fabrics, you might not have enough. Do you see how it really varies how much fabric you'll have left at the end of the strip? You know, some of them like this much, and some just this much. And some of them, of course, if they're partials, will have run out completely. That's okay. If you are using non-batik fabrics or batiks or other fabrics that have less than 42 inches of usable width, then you're going to need additional strips. All right, so I'm going to get these sorted and then come back. Okay, I have all of my strips cut. And I have them laid out on one of my large design boards. And there is a free tutorial for how to make those design boards if you want one. And you can see here's my lights. Here's my mediums, relatively. Here's my darks. And notice this little guy. He can go either light or dark, depending on what I need, because I know that not all these strips were full length. So that's kind of my cushion. So there are no rules about your sizes. There's no rules about how many strips or how big this needs to be. But if you want to make it the same size as my samples, I used 93 pieces for the small one. And those pieces were 2.5 by 5.5 cut. And for the larger one, which this is going to be, I cut them 2.5 by 6 inches. And I'm using 111 pieces. You ready to get started? It's so exciting at this point. All right, are we ready for the magic? Now, normally, I would just make my piles and take them to the sewing machine, but I'm going to lay this first one at least partially out so that you can see. I'm going to start with a dark, and then I'm going to come in with a medium. It's going to be sewn like that. And then a light. And then I'm going to pick another dark. And, you know, I'm going to mix these up a little bit. Okay, there's a dark and then a medium. I'll go like that. A medium and then a light. How about we'll bring this one in? And you know what? This reminds me, let me bring this over again. I want to show you something because I really was intentional about creating an autumnal palette. So you can see I've got a lot of greens and browns and orange and gold, but I also brought in some blue. There's a little bit of blue there, a little tiny bit there, quite a bit there, just a little bit, some blue undertones in here, and few in there. And I did that not because you have to, but because I like when I do a quilt that has a very warm palette, I like to bring in some contrasting cooler colors as well, just as little accents. So that's what that was about. So let's keep going. And then a medium. And then we'll bring in another light. And if you're looking at this and you don't like something, you think, oh, that's going to really stand out. I'm not sure I like that. Well, let me grab the finished one, pull it over. In the finished one, those little light bits, that contrast of light and dark, is what helps create sparkle and a little bit of luminosity. So it's good to have those contrasting areas. But, the bottom line is if you don't like the way something looks, you can always pull it out and put something else in there. Okay, maybe you like that better. Maybe instead we'll put this orange over here. There really are no rules. It's whatever you like best. So I'm going to lay out. I'm not going to make you watch me do it, but I'm going to lay out 37 strips for the first row, and I'm just going to pile them up, and I'm going to put them in order, dark, medium, light, dark, medium, light, until I get to 37, and that'll be my first pile. Now, I also want to point out, these are batik fabrics, so they really don't have a right side, wrong side. I mean, there kind of is, but it doesn't matter because the color goes all the way through to the back, so you don't have to sweat it. Okay? I'm going to get these prepped so that I can show you how to sew them. Okay, a quick detour before we start sewing. For those of you who are planners, and I know some of you are, if you want to lay out your pieces for each row, you certainly can. I did here, and you can see for this row, I started with a dark, and then I just went dark, medium, light, dark, medium, light. This one I started with a light, dark, medium, light, dark, medium, light. And then this row is back to dark, medium, light, and just went on like that. I also looked for any of the ones that were more likely to pop, like this green or this blue, and tried to make sure that they were kind of evenly distributed across my rows. Other than that, I pretty much let whatever happened, happened. And again, you don't need to think through this much if you don't want to. You can just grab and sew. But this is how I've chosen to create some sparkle. So now we've got our first stack here. And I am going to take a pin to mark this as my first strip. And again, you don't have to do this. I think it just can be helpful so that you don't get accidentally turned around. And this piecing looks complex, but it's really not. You just have to remember where you're at and what you're adding to. And I'll also say you're going to notice some different things about my machine, probably. Now, you can do this on any machine that has a straight stitch. You don't need a fancy machine for this, but I have a fancy machine. So I'm going to be using my stop-start button. I'm going to be using my auto trim and auto raising the presser foot. So now I've taken, there's strip one, here's the second one. I'm going to lay that over, and I want to line up this corner as precisely as I can. So it's lined up here, here, and if I peel that back, you can see there's that corner. And now I'm going to sew right here. I think it slipped. Okay, so I'm going to lower my presser foot and just going to sew that. And I'm going to go ahead and sew the full length of this one, even though I don't technically need to. All right, now pull that out. And so here we have the first one. And the reason I went ahead and finished that seam is so that I could finger press this seam allowance. That's the only time we're going to have to do that. Okay. And I'm just using my fingers to just press that. I'm not using my fingernail. I don't want to stretch the fabric. If you have a seam roller, you could do that, but I think just a little, the pad of your finger is enough. All right. So there's our first two pieces. Now here's the pin showing where it is when we add the first piece. Now we're going to turn this. And I'm going to add the next piece right here. All right, so this is where the next piece goes. And I'm even going to rotate it here just because I like the way those colors are. Now, when I put this on, I'm going to match the top. I'm going to match this corner. All right, and this is perfectly even here. And you can pin it if you want to. I'm just going to finger pin it. Lower the presser foot and just stitch right down. Okay. You pull that out. And again, I'm going to open this up. And so the seam allowance is always pointed towards the new piece. So now I'm going to use the pad of my finger to press that out. And then I'm going to swing it back. See, there's our pin. There's our pin in the original position. Now I'm going to add the next piece. The next piece is going to go just like that. So again, I'm going to line up the top corner, line up the bottom corner. Now, do you see sometimes there's a little sliver sticking out? Just gently stroke that fabric until everything is even on this side. Then you're ready to sew it. Okay. I'm going to finger press this. Now for the next piece, it's going to go right there just to sew it. So the next piece is going to go right there. So to sew it, we're going to swing around again. Grab the next piece. It's going to go right like that. I'm going to line up the bottom and the top. And then I'm going to look for this. Just kind of stroke that over so this is all even. Then I'm going to sew it. Let me fix that. Okay, then open it up. Just finger press it. And when you finger press, make sure you don't have any pleats in that seam. Make sure it's all the way open. You don't want to stretch the fabric, but you do want it completely open. And then we'll rotate it back so the pin is at the bottom again. And then we'll add the next piece. Just like that. Now I'll do just a couple more because I want you to see what happens as this grows. All right, so there's this piece. I won't make you watch the whole strip. Okay, and we'll finger press that open. And now, remember the pin was at the bottom. Now the pin is going to be up there again so that we can add the next piece. Just like that. Okay, everything's in position. And I'm using a 1/4 inch foot. You don't have to. Just use something that you can get a consistent seam allowance with. All right, and then here it is at the top. Now we're going to put the pin at the bottom, and the next piece would go right here. Okay, that's the next piece. But I want to show you as this grows, this is going to get longer and longer, and it might start to feel awkward. So at that point, and I'm going to pull this aside and ask Connor to give me one of my long ones. All right. So it's one of the ones that's really long. So if I was going to sew, here, let me get this thread underneath. If I was going to sew another piece on there, what I would do is just flip this long tail. Here, do you want to do it on the other side of the camera there? Flip this long tail up and out of the way so that I could put this next piece in place without having all this extra length stuck underneath my arm or trailing off the table. I hope that makes sense. All right. So then the key is to just keep adding pieces one at a time. Just remember, I'm going to sew on this edge, then we're going to rotate, sew on this edge, this edge. And that's how you build your braids. And at this point, they're going to have irregular edges. Here, I'll angle this so you can see this a little bit better. You know, you're going to have these irregular edges, and that is exactly what you should have because we are going to do some trimming pretty soon. So now all my strips have been sewn into my rows. I have 3 of these columns, and I'm showing you this because I wanted to show you how I pressed it. We finger pressed as we went along, but then I used the iron to just press everything towards the top of the strip. All the seams are in one direction. And then I turned it over and pressed again from the bottom towards the top, just to make sure everything is nice and flat. There's no puckers. We're good to go. The next thing I did, and it's going to be hard to see on camera, but I took my ruler. Now I'm going to be cutting these 6.5 inches wide, and I'm not at a good angle to see, so this is not going to be precise, but I laid this ruler on my rows, and I just used a chalk pencil like this to mark just general guidelines. Those are not going to be my actual cutting lines, but they are close enough that it's going to give me a good guideline. So then what I'm going to do next is I took the 1/4 inch foot off and I just put a regular presser foot on. And now I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch and just eyeball it. Doesn't need to be perfect, away from those chalk lines. And what I'm doing is called stay stitching. I want to make sure that these don't stretch as I'm cutting them and then as I'm sewing my columns together. I want to make sure they'll be nice and stable because I'm going to be creating bias edges. And I want those bias edges to be reinforced and protected. So that's what I'm going to do next. And I'm not going to make you watch me, but I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. Okay, now we're ready to start trimming, but I wanted to show you the smaller runner for a sec. Because these strips were not as long, they're the same width, but they're not as long. These columns finish 5 inches wide, which means when I trimmed them, they were 5.5 inches wide. Okay, now these, because these strips are longer, I'm actually going to be able to cut them so that my columns are going to be cut 6.5 inches wide, and they'll finish at 6 inches. And so what I'm going to do is line this up, and I'm going to keep an eye on those edges. I want to make sure that the corners here are outside the ruler. They're off the ruler. And I also like to find, like, for example, this point here is falling on this line pretty well. So that's going to be a good way for me to make sure things are pretty straight. And the nice thing about this is it is fairly forgiving as long as you're consistent. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and cut this. All right. Now, if you are a starch person, you could certainly starch this. But you can see, here's my stay stitching that I just eyeballed. So the line wobbles, it's pretty wobbly, but it's less than a 1/4 inch in on the column. So when I take this seam, that stay stitching will be completely hidden. So it doesn't matter if it wobbles. All right. So I'm going to keep going, lining this up. And remember, I'm watching what's happening here. I'm watching what's happening here. And I'm also trying to keep that point more or less in the same spot all the way up. All right. Now I'm going to just take that cut. And here I'm going to stop because I would have to do gymnastics to be able to do this all on camera. And I am not that nimble. So I'm actually going to stop the camera, finish cutting, and then show you what it looks like. Okay, I am back just to show you the second side. And the second side is much easier because we can just line this up over here and then come in and cut the second side. But make sure to walk your hand. Did you see how I walked my hand? Here, let me get this lined up again. So I'm lining it up with the cut edge, and I'm cutting 6.5 inches wide. This ruler is 6.5 inches, which is really handy. And cutting and then moving my hand up with the cutter. And that's as far as I can reach. So I'm going to have to pull it down some more. And then keep cutting. It's as easy as that. And that stay stitching is going to help keep everything from stretching. Okay, here we are. Now I know you can't see everything, but I've got the 3 columns done. Now I did not trim the ends yet. I've left those on. I'm not going to trim those to the very end because now what I'm going to do is I like to offset these a little bit so that they are intentionally not lined up. So I'm going to shimmy this down. I think we've got it. All right. So now I am going to clip these together and then sew them. I didn't use any pins or clips before, but now I'm going to use lots because I want to make sure these fragile edges don't stretch. So I'm going to sew these long seams. And once I've sewn those seams, then I'll trim the ends so that they're nice and even. Okay? And again, I don't think you need to watch me sew those seams, so I'm going to pause here. Folks, we are on the home stretch. I wanted to give you just a couple of quick tips about the pressing. All right, when you sew these and the sewing, okay, when you sew your columns together, don't try to sew in this direction against the seams because that's going to drive you crazy because these are going to keep flipping over. Instead, go from the other direction so that you can sew in the same direction as the seams. That's going to be a lot easier. And then once they are sewn together, all 3 are sewn together, first I pressed them exactly the way they were sewn. So I'm pressing before I'm opening. So I'm pressing it flat, and that just helps to set the seam or set the stitches. And then opening it up, and I pressed this seam towards this piece, this seam towards this. So both of them are pressed away from the center. Now, if you prefer, you could certainly press these open to reduce bulk. I did not want to deal with all of those little pieces. So I chose to press them away from the center. Okay, now the last thing we have to do is trim the edges. So this one is already trimmed. So I'm going to show you how I trimmed that by doing the other one. Isn't this exciting? We're almost done, guys. All right, well, with this part, it still has to be quilted, but that's another day. All right, so here we go. I am going to line this up, line the pieces up with my mat, and then I'm going to find the lowest point, which on this one I think is, well, it's either here or here. And I want to make sure, oh, it's right here. So I can go a little bit higher. All right, I want to make sure I'm not creating any gaps in there. All right, and now I'm ready to just cut across. And now I have my clean edge. All right, now we have a table runner. I'm going to fold it in half because it's not going to show here. Now we have a finished runner. So the next shot is I'm going to lay them up on the design wall so that you can see the two sizes. All right, see you back in just a sec. And there we are. Here's both sizes of the table runners. Obviously the larger one on the top. Now the bottom one is already free motion quilted. I'll show you a quick close-up of how that looks. Now the top one, I probably will go ahead and do something with the walking foot just to be different. When it's done, I'll do a community post so that everybody can see how it turned out. Meanwhile, if you're ready to go ahead and finish yours, there are basting videos and videos with quilting tips on my channel. Feel free to look around and help yourselves. And I hope you'll come back and join me for more fun with quilting stuff in the future. And hey, those of you who are in the membership, don't forget to download your free printable. It is not a full pattern, but it is an easy cheat sheet with all the sizes of everything for the two table runners. And if you're not in the membership, don't worry, you can make it without it. It's just a bonus. Okay, happy quilting, everybody.